classify them as black exploitation films in the early 1970s, all the way to the books that have been published by um, pimps like Pimpin' Ken
Oh,
and some of the others that have been and even stuff that's been portrayed in music. Um, but let's talk about first the two different types of pimps. Um, we all know what a pimp is, right? A person who's associated with or usually extorts control over and lives off the earnings of a prostitute, right?
mm,
Um, the first type of pimp that everybody is aware of or knows of is a gorilla pimp that we classify. A pimp that physically beats um, all the women in his stable.
mhm.
And we talk about, okay, the term stable. Do we know what a stable is? And we keep digressing because, we're talking about a completely different underground world here. We're
Yes.
talking about a different language that they speak. When I use these terms like stable, stable is kind of like what you think about a horse stable. Um, it's where you keep all of your women, and you have various different kinds of women, and or men, um, or boys or girls. You have think about it as a used car lot. I hate to use the analogy, but let's just say a used car lot or a car lot. You have very different types of models to choose from. In this instance, you're talking about a blonde haired young lady, a brunette, um, brown hair, short, tall, lighter skin, darker skin, black. So you have all different types of women, shapes and sizes. And a pimp is going to have a lot of different variations in his stable um, to satisfy his clientele. So with that being said, you have a gorilla pimp. A gorilla pimp is a guy who beats his or guy or girl who beats usually his all of his girls. So if someone doesn't is lazy and doesn't want to get up to go make money, they physically get beaten. If they come up short of their money, they physically get beaten. If for some reason they just look the wrong way, they physically get beaten. Um, that's a gorilla pimp. Now the other pimp that you have is a finesse pimp or a Romeo pimp, and this one is more looking toward more the psychological um, Vietnam, we'll call it. They raise psychological warfare on you. They'll get you to think that you're in love with them. You're doing this for them, and you're working as a team. Um, uh, there's a lot less physical abuse in that relationship with that Romeo pimp, but there. Don't get me wrong. There's still abuse. It's just a lot less. Where, for example, he may not beat every girl in his stable, um, but what he will do is maybe focus on one and use that beating as an example to show all the other women in the stable or girls in the stable that this is what can happen to them. And the person that usually gets physically abused is the bottom. Um, Again, some of these terms I'm going to use, you may not be familiar with. You can familiarize yourselves with them
Mhm.
by just Googling human trafficking terminology.
Oh,
Um, and it'll show you a lot of these terms that are used on the street and in this world. And when I train other like first responders, social workers, nurses, physicians in the ER, um, and even some mental health professionals, the first thing that we have to do is we have to learn terminology. Because if you don't learn the terminology, the victims will not talk to you.
oh,
If they're talking to you and they're using these terms and you're looking at them with like they got three heads, or you're like, what are you talking about? They will shut down because you do not understand where they're coming from. You don't understand what they're going through. So, um, I first and foremost, I tell people to familiarize themselves with the terminology. So those are the two kinds of different pimps that we encounter out here. Um, and I understand that you guys went over a little bit about human trafficking, the difference between prostitution and human trafficking. Am I correct?
Well, I don't know, were you able to watch Very Young Girls, everybody?
No, even on Amazon Prime, you still have to pay $35 for it. It's like you're buying a digital version of it instead of just streaming it.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
What about like I Am Jane Doe? Has anybody ever seen I Am Jane Doe?
Mm-mm.
That was the story about the plight to shut down Backpage.
Oh, that's a good one.
I often use, if I was with you guys and I was in in a classroom setting, I would share with you a little segment that I had taken from the Discovery Channel. It was called America Undercover, and this episode was called The Sex Trade, and they broke it down into three parts. The part that I always show, even though I don't like showing it because it kind of perpetuates this whole stereotype that all Black men are pimps. But one thing that's really interesting about that segment is that it focuses on the traveling pimp, and it showcases a guy from Cleveland, and his bottom, or his number one girl, was also from Cleveland. Now, he grew up in Cleveland Heights. His name is Calvin Winbush, AKA Good Game. And his girl is Sonora Armstrong, who was from 140th and Kinsman area. And there he tells in his own words how he runs the games. He refers to himself as a true stomp down pimp. That's a guerrilla pimp. And that segment is that when the reporter comes into the room with his cameraman, his bottom, the girl that's in the room with, doesn't even acknowledge their presence. And so about 5 minutes into the interview, he says, "Hey, I walked in and Seashell, she calls herself, didn't even recognize me or say anything to me." He says, "Because she won't do that until I tell her to." It's the pimp control that is utilized. How long it took to reprogram somebody to do that. And this is the type of control that's exerted over a lot of these victims. Stuff that you can't see, stuff that sometimes they don't even know what's going on until they get into therapy. And that's what makes our job really, really hard, is when we recover these victims and we try to help them, a lot of them don't even realize that they're being exploited. And it's really, really interesting. And as long as I've been doing this now, I've been doing this since the latter part of 2007. It's really interesting to see when a victim begins to understand that they're being used and they're being exploited. You almost see the proverbial light bulb going off over their head, and their eyes light up like, holy crap, this guy's been using me all this time. And at that point, that they're now on the road back to recovery. And that's an extremely difficult and long road, especially when you throw in the fact that a lot of these pimps out here